Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring After the Bomb. A Bad Day for Sales by Fritz Leiber. The Answer by H. Beam Piper. The Smart Ones by Jack Sharkey. Not a Creature Was Stirring by Dean Evans. Flight Through Tomorrow by Stanton A. Coblentz. A Bad Day for Sales by Fritz Leiber, originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, July 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The big bright doors of the office building parted with a pneumatic whoosh, and Robbie glided onto Times Square. The crowd that had been watching the 50-foot-tall girl on the clothing billboard get dressed, or reading the latest news about the hot truce scrawl itself in yard-high script, hurried to look. Robbie was still a novelty. Robbie was fun. For a little while yet, he could steal the show. But the attention did not make Robbie proud. He had no more emotions than the pink plastic giantess who dressed and undressed endlessly whether there was a crowd or the street was empty, and who never once blinked her blue mechanical eyes. But she merely drew business, while Robbie went out after it. For Robbie was the logical conclusion of the development of vending machines. All the earlier ones had stood in one place, on a floor or hanging on a wall, and blankly delivered merchandise in return for coins, whereas Robbie searched for customers. He was the demonstration model of a line of sales robots to be manufactured by Schuler vending machines, provided the public invested enough in stocks to give the company capital to go into mass production. The publicity Robbie drew stimulated investments handsomely. It was amusing to see the TV and newspaper coverage of Robbie's selling, but not a fraction as much fun as being approached personally by him. Those who were usually bought anywhere from 1 to 500 shares, if they had any money and foresight enough to see that sales robots would eventually be on every street and highway in the country. Robbie radared the crowd, found that it had surrounded him solidly, and stopped. With a carefully built-in sense of timing, he waited for the tension and expectation to mount before he began talking. "Say, Ma, he doesn't look like a robot at all," a child said. "He looks like a turtle," which was not completely inaccurate. The lower part of Robbie's body was a metal hemisphere hemmed with sponge rubber and not quite touching the sidewalk. The upper was a metal box with black holes in it. The box could swivel and duck. A chromium bright hoop skirt with a turret on top. "Reminds me too much of the Little Joe Paratanks," a legless veteran of the Persian War muttered, and rapidly rolled himself away on wheels rather like Robbie's. His departure made it easier for some of those who knew about Robbie to open a path in the crowd. Robbie headed straight for the gap. The crowd whooped. Robbie glided very slowly down the path, deftly jogging aside whenever he got too close to ankles in skylon or sockasins. The rubber buffer on his hoop skirt was merely an added safeguard. The boy who had called Robbie a turtle jumped in the middle of the path and stood his ground, grinning foxily. Robbie stopped 2 feet short of him. The turret ducked. The crowd got quiet. "Hello, youngster," Robbie said in a voice that was smooth as that of a TV star, and was, in fact, a recording of one. The boy stopped smiling. "Hello," he whispered. "How old are you?" Robbie asked. 9. No, 8. "That's nice," Robbie observed. A metal arm shot down from his neck, stopped just short of the boy. The boy jerked back. For you, Robbie said. The boy gingerly took the red polylop from the neatly fashioned blunt metal claws and began to unwrap it. Nothing to say? Asked Robbie. Thank you. After a suitable pause, Robbie continued. And how about a nice refreshing drink of poppy pop to go with your polylop? The boy lifted his eyes, but didn't stop licking the candy. Robbie waggled his claws slightly. Just give me a quarter, and within 5 seconds... A little girl wriggled out of the forest of legs. Give me a polylop too, Robbie, she demanded. Rita, come back here, a woman in the third rank of the crowd called angrily. Robbie scanned the newcomer gravely. His reference silhouettes were not good enough to let him distinguish the sex of children, so he merely repeated, Hello, youngster. Rita, give me a polylop. Disregarding both remarks, for a good salesman is single-minded and does not waste bait, Robbie said winningly, I'll bet you read Junior Space Killers. Now I have here... I'm a girl. He got a polylop. At the word girl, Robbie broke off. Rather ponderously, he said, I'll bet you read G.G. Jones, Space Tripper. Now I have here the latest issue of that thrilling comic, not yet in the stationary vending machines. Just give me 50 cents, and within 5... Please let me through. I'm her mother. A young woman in the front rank drawled over a powder-sprayed shoulder. I'll get her for you, and slithered out on 6-inch platform shoes. Run away, children, she said nonchalantly. Lifting her arms behind her head, she pirouetted slowly before Robbie to show how much she did for her bolero half-jacket and her form-fitting slacks that melted into skylon just above the knees. The little girl glared at her. She ended the pirouette in profile. At this age level, Robbie's reference silhouettes permitted him to distinguish sex, though with occasional amusing and embarrassing miscalls. He whistled admiringly. The crowd cheered. Someone remarked critically to a friend, It would go her better if it was built more like a real robot. You know, like a man. The friend shook his head. This way is subtler. No one in the crowd was watching the news script overhead as it scribbled, Ice pack for hot truce. Vanadin hints Russ may yield on Pakistan. Robbie was saying, In the savage new glamour tint we have christened Mars blood, complete with spray applicator and fit-all finger stalls that mask each finger completely except for the nail. Just give me $5. Uncrumpled bills may be fed into the revolving rollers you see beside my arm, and within 5 seconds... No thanks, Robbie, the young woman yawned. Remember, Robbie persisted, for 3 more weeks, seductivizing Mars blood will be unobtainable from any other robot or human vendor. No thanks. Robbie scanned the crowd resourcefully. Is there any gentleman here? He began just as a woman elbowed her way through the front rank. I told you to come back, she snapped at the little girl. But I didn't get my polylop. Who would care to? Rita! Robbie cheated! Ow! Meanwhile, the young woman in the half-bolero had scanned the nearby gentlemen on her own. Deciding that there was less than a 50% chance of any of them accepting the proposition Robbie seemed about to make, she took advantage of the scuffle to slither gracefully back into the ranks. Once again the path was clear before Robbie. He paused, however, for a brief recapitulation of the more magical properties of Mars blood, including a telling phrase about the passionate claws of a Martian sunrise. But no one bought. It wasn't quite time. Soon enough, silver coins would be clinking, bills going through the rollers faster than laundry, and 500 people struggling for the privilege of having their money taken away from them by America's first mobile sales robot. But there were still some tricks that Robbie had to do free, and one certainly should enjoy those before starting the more expensive fun. So Robbie moved on until he reached the curb. The variation in level was instantly sensed by his underscanners. He stopped. His head began to swivel. The crowd watched in eager silence. This was Robbie's best trick. Robbie's head stopped swiveling. His scanners had found the traffic light. It was green. Robbie edged forward. But then the light turned red. Robbie stopped again, still on the curb. The crowd softly ahed its delight. It was wonderful to be alive and watching Robbie on such an exciting day. Alive and amused in the fresh weather-controlled air between the lines of bright skyscrapers with their winking windows, and under a sky so blue you could almost call it dark. But way, way up, where the crowd could not see, the sky was darker still, purple dark, with stars showing, and in that purple dark a silver-green something, the colour of a bud, plunged down at better than 3 miles a second. The silver-green was a newly developed paint that foiled radar. Robbie was saying, "While we wait for the light, there's time for you youngsters to enjoy a nice refreshing poppy pop. Or, for you adults, only those over 5 feet tall are eligible to buy, to enjoy an exciting poppy pop fizz. Just give me a quarter, or, in the case of adults, $1.25. I'm licensed to dispense intoxicating liquors, and within 5 seconds—" But that was not cutting it quite fine enough. Just 3 seconds later, the silver-green bud bloomed above Manhattan into a globular orange flower. The skyscrapers grew brighter and brighter still, the brightness of the inside of the sun. The windows winked blossoming white fireflowers. The crowd around Robbie bloomed too. Their clothes puffed into petals of flame. Their heads of hair were torches. The orange flower grew, stem and blossom. The blast came. The winking windows shattered tier by tier, became black holes. The walls bent, rocked, cracked. A stony dandruff flaked from their cornices. The flaming flowers of the sidewalk were all levelled at once. Robbie was shoved 10 feet. His metal hoop skirt dimpled, regaining its shape. The blast ended. The orange flower, grown vast, vanished overhead on its huge magic beanstalk. It grew dark and very still. The cornice dandruff pattered down. A few small fragments rebounded from the metal hoop skirt. Robbie made some small, uncertain movements, as if feeling for broken bones. He was hunting for the traffic light, but it no longer shone either red nor green. He slowly scanned a full circle. There was nothing anywhere to interest his reference silhouettes. Yet whenever he tried to move, his underscanners warned him of low obstructions. It was very puzzling. The silence was disturbed by moans and a crackling sound, as faint at first as the scampering of distant rats. A seared man, his charred clothes fuming where the blast had blown out the fire, rose from the curb. Robbie scanned him. "Good day, sir," Robbie said. "Would you care for a smoke? A truly cool smoke. Now I have here a yet unmarketed brand." But the customer had run away, screaming, and Robbie never ran after customers, though he could follow them at a medium brisk roll. He worked his way along the curb where the man had sprawled, carefully keeping his distance from the low obstructions, some of which writhed now and then, forcing him to jog. Shortly he reached a fire hydrant. He scanned it. His electronic vision, though it still worked, had been somewhat blurred by the blast. "Hello, youngster," Robbie said. Then, after a long pause, cat got your tongue? Well, I have a little present for you. A nice, lovely pollylop. Take it, youngster, he said after another pause. It's for you. Don't be afraid. His attention was distracted by other customers who began to rise up oddly here and there, twisting forms that confused his reference silhouettes and would not stay to be scanned properly. One cried, "Water!" but no quarter clinked in Robbie's claws when he caught the word and suggested, "How about a nice refreshing drink of poppy pop?" The rat crackling of the flames had become a jungle muttering. The blind windows began to wink fire again. A little girl marched, stepping neatly over arms and legs she did not look at. A white dress and the once taller bodies around her had shielded her from the brilliance and the blast. Her eyes were fixed on Robbie. In them was the same imperious confidence, though none of the delight with which she had watched him earlier. "Help me, Robbie," she said. "I want my mother." "Hello, youngster," Robbie said. "What would you like? Comics? Candy?" "Where is she, Robbie? Take me to her." "Balloons? Would you like to watch me blow up a balloon?" The little girl began to cry. The sound triggered off another of Robbie's novelty circuits, a service feature that had brought in a lot of favourable publicity. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "Are you in trouble? Are you lost?" "Yes, Robbie, take me to my mother." "Stay right there," Robbie said reassuringly, "and don't be frightened. I will call a policeman." He whistled shrilly twice. Time passed. Robbie whistled again. The windows flared and roared. The little girl begged, "Take me away, Robbie," and jumped onto a little step in his hoop skirt. "Give me a dime," Robbie said. The little girl found one in her pocket and put it in his claws. "Your weight," Robbie said, "is 54½ pounds. "Have you seen my daughter? Have you seen her?" A woman was crying somewhere. "I left her watching that thing while I stepped inside. Rita!" "Robbie, help me!" The little girl began babbling at her. "He knew I was lost. He even called the police, but they didn't come. He weighed me too, didn't you, Robbie?" But Robbie had gone off to peddle poppy pop to the members of a rescue squad which had just come around the corner, more robot-like in their asbestos suits than he in his metal skin. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. The Answer by H. Beam Piper. Originally published in Fantastic Universe Science Fiction, December 1959. Narrated by Tom Trussel. For a moment, after the screen door snapped and wakened him, Lee Richardson sat breathless and motionless, his eyes still closed, trying desperately to cling to the dream imprinted upon his conscious memory before it faded. "Are you there, Lee?" he heard Alexis Petov's voice. "Yes, I'm here. What time is it?" he asked, and then added, "I fell asleep. I was dreaming." It was all right. He was going to be able to remember. He could still see the slim woman with the greying blonde hair, playing with the little dachshund among the new fallen leaves on the lawn. He was glad they'd both been in this dream together. These dream glimpses were all he'd had for the last 15 years, and they were too precious to lose. He opened his eyes. The Russian was sitting just outside the light from the open door of the bungalow, lighting a cigarette. For a moment he could see the blocky, high-cheeked face, now pouched and wrinkled, and then the flame went out, and there was only the red coal glowing in the darkness. He closed his eyes again, and the dream picture came back to him. The woman catching the little dog and raising her head as though to speak to him. Plenty of time yet. Petov was speaking German instead of Spanish, as they always did between themselves. They're still counting down from -3 hours. I just phoned the launching site for a jeep. Eugenio's been there ever since dinner. They say he's running around like a cat looking for a place to have her first litter of kittens. He chuckled. This would be something new for Eugenio Galvez, for which he could be thankful. I hope the generators don't develop any last-second bugs, he said. We'll only be 1.5 miles away, and that'll be too close to 50 kilos of nega matter if the field collapses. It'll be all right, Petov assured him. The bugs have all been chased out years ago. Not out of those generators in the rocket, they're new. He fumbled in his coat pocket for his pipe and tobacco. I never thought I'd run another nuclear bomb test as long as I lived. Lee, Petov was shocked. You mustn't call it that. It isn't that at all. It's purely a scientific experiment. Wasn't that all any of them were? We made lots of experiments like this back before 1969. The memories of all those other tests, each ending in an Everest-high mushroom column, rose in his mind. And the end result, the United States and the Soviet Union blasted to rubble. A whole hemisphere pushed back into the Dark Ages, 250 million dead, including a slim woman with greying blonde hair, and a little red dog, and a girl from Odessa whom Alexis Petov had been going to marry. Forgive me, Alexis, I just couldn't help remembering. I suppose it's this shot we're going to make tonight. It's so much like the other ones before. He hesitated slightly. Before the Auburn bomb. There, he'd come out and said it. In all the years they'd worked together at the Instituto Argentino de Ciencia Física, that had been unmentioned between them. The families of hanged cutthroats avoid mention of ropes and knives. He thumbed the old-fashioned American lighter and held it to his pipe. Across the veranda, in the darkness, he knew that Petov was looking intently at him. "You've been thinking about that lately, haven't you?" the Russian asked, and then, timidly, "Was that what you were dreaming of?" "Oh, no, thank heaven." "I think about it too, always. I suppose," he seemed relieved, now that it had been brought out into the open and could be discussed. "You saw it fall, didn't you?" "That's right, from about 30 miles away. A little closer than we'll be to this shot tonight. I was in charge of the investigation at Auburn, until we had New York and Washington and Detroit and Moberly and San Francisco to worry about. Then what had happened to Auburn wasn't important anymore. We were trying to get evidence to lay before the United Nations. We kept at it for about 12 hours after the United Nations had ceased to exist. I could never understand about that, Lee. I don't know what the truth is. I probably never shall. But I know that my government did not launch that missile. During the first days after yours began coming in, I talked to people who had been in the Kremlin at the time. One had been in the presence of Klizenko himself when the news of your bombardment arrived. He said that Klizenko was absolutely stunned. We always believed that your government decided upon a preemptive surprise attack and picked out a town, Auburn, New York, that had been hit by one of our first retaliation missiles, and claimed that it had been hit first. He shook his head. Auburn was hit an hour before the first American missile was launched. I know that to be a fact. We could never understand why you launched just that one, and no more until after ours began landing on you, while you threw away the advantage of surprise and priority of attack. Because we didn't do it, Lee. The Russian's voice trembled with earnestness. You believe me when I tell you that? Yes, I believe you. After all that happened, and all that you, and I, and the people you worked with, and the people I worked with, and your government, and mine, have been guilty of, it would be a waste of breath for either of us to try to lie to the other about what happened 15 years ago. He drew slowly on his pipe. But who launched it then? It had to be launched by somebody. Don't you think I've been tormenting myself with that question for the last 15 years? Petov demanded. You know, there were people inside the Soviet Union. Not many, and they kept themselves well hidden, who were dedicated to the overthrow of the Soviet regime. They, or some of them, might have thought that the devastation of both our countries and the obliteration of civilization in the Northern Hemisphere would be a cheap price to pay for ending the rule of the Communist Party. Could they have built an ICBM with a thermonuclear warhead in secret? He asked. There were also fanatical nationalist groups in Europe, both sides of the Iron Curtain, who might have thought our mutual destruction would be worth the risks involved. There was China and India. If your country and mine wiped each other out, they could go back to the old ways and the old traditions. Or Japan, or the Muslim states. In the end, they all went down along with us. But what criminal ever expects to fall? We have too many suspects, and the trail's too cold, Alexis. That rocket wouldn't have had to have been launched anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. For instance, our friends here in the Argentine have been doing very well by themselves since El Coloso del Norte went down. And there were the Australians, picking themselves up bargains in real estate in the East Indies at gunpoint. And there were the Boers trekking north again, in tanks instead of ox wagons. And Brazil, with a not too implausible pretender to the Braganza throne, calling itself the Portuguese Empire, and looking eastward. And to complete the picture, here were Professor Dr. Lee Richardson and Comrade Professor Alexis Petrovich Petov, getting ready to test a missile with a matter annihilation warhead. No, this thing just wasn't a weapon. A jeep came round the corner, lighting the dark roadway between the bungalows, its radio on and counting down. 22 minutes, 21, 59, 58, 57. It came to a stop in front of their bungalow at exactly -2 hours, 21 minutes, 54 seconds. The driver called out in Spanish, "Dr. Richardson, Dr. Petov, are you ready?" "Yes, ready, we're coming." They both got to their feet, Richardson pulling himself up reluctantly. The older you get, the harder it is to leave a comfortable chair. He settled himself beside his colleague and former enemy, and the jeep started again, rolling between the buildings of the living quarters area and out onto the long straight road across the pampas toward the distant blaze of electric lights. He wondered why he had been thinking so much lately about the Auburn bomb. He'd questioned at times, indignantly of course, whether Russia had launched it. But it wasn't until tonight, until he had heard what Petov had had to say, that he seriously doubted it. Petov wouldn't lie about it, and Petov would have been in a position to have known the truth if the missile had been launched from Russia. Then he stopped thinking about what was water, or blood, a long time over the dam. The special policeman at the entrance to the launching site reminded them that they were both smoking. When they extinguished, respectively, their cigarette and pipe, he waved the jeep on and went back to his argument with a carload of tourists who wanted to get a good view of the launching. There now, Lee. Do you need anything else to convince you that this isn't a weapon project? Pitov asked. No, now that you mention it, I don't. You know, I don't believe I've had to show an identity card the whole time I've been here. I don't believe I have an identity card, Pitov said. Think of that. The lights blazed everywhere around them, but mostly about the rocket that towered above everything else, so thick that it seemed squat. The gantry cranes had been hauled away now, and it stood alone, but it was still wreathed in thick electric cables. They were pouring enough current into that thing to light half the streetlights in Buenos Aires. When the cables were blown free by separation charges at the blast-off, the generators powered by the rocket engines had better be able to take over, because if the magnetic field collapsed and that 50-kilo chunk of negative proton matter came in contact with natural positive proton matter, an old-fashioned H-bomb would be a firecracker to what would happen. Just 100 kilos of pure 200 proof MC2. The driver took them around the rocket, dodging assorted trucks and mobile machinery that were being hurried out of the way. The countdown was just beyond 2 hours 5 minutes. The jeep stopped at the edge of a crowd around 3 more trucks, and Dr. Eugenio Galvez, the director of the institute, left the crowd and approached at an awkward half-run as they got down. "Is everything checked, gentlemen?" he wanted to know. "It was this afternoon at 17:30, Pitov told him, "and nobody's been burning my telephone to report anything different. Are the balloons and the drone planes ready?" "The Air Force just finished checking. They're ready. Captain Urquhart flew one of the planes over the course and made a guidance tape. That's been duplicated, and all the planes are equipped with copies." "How's the wind?" Richardson asked. "Still steady. We won't have any trouble about fallout or the balloons." "Then we'd better go back to the bunker and make sure everybody there is on the job." The loudspeaker was counting down to 2 hours, 1 minute. "Could you spare a few minutes to talk to the press?" Eugenio Galvez asked, "and perhaps say a few words for telecast? This last is most important. We can't explain too many times the purpose of this experiment. There is still much hostility arising from fear that we are testing a nuclear weapon." The press and telecast services were well represented. There were close to 100 correspondents from all over South America, from South Africa and Australia, even one from Ceylon. They had 3 trucks with mobile telecast pickups, and when they saw who was approaching, they released the 2 rocketry experts they had been quizzing and pounced on their new victims. Was there any possibility that negative proton matter might be used as a weapon? "Anything can be used as a weapon. You could stab a man to death with that lead pencil you're using," Pitov replied, "but I doubt if nega matter will ever be so used. We're certainly not working on weapons design here. We started 6 years ago with the ability to produce negative protons, reverse spin neutrons, and positrons, and the theoretical possibility of assembling them into nega matter. We have just gotten a 50-kilogram mass of nega iron assembled. In those 6 years, we had to invent all our techniques and design all our equipment. If we'd been insane enough to want to build a nuclear weapon, after what we went through up north, we could have done so from memory and designed a better, which is to say, a worse, one from memory in a few days. Yes, and building a nega matter bomb for military purposes would be like digging a 50-foot shaft to get a rock to bash somebody's head in, when you could do the job better with the shovel you're digging with," Richardson added. "The time, money, energy and work we put in on this thing would be ample to construct 20 thermonuclear bombs, and that's only a small part of it." He went on to tell them about the magnetic bottle inside the rocket's warhead, mentioning how much electric current was needed to keep up the magnetic field that insulated the nega matter from contact with posimatter. "Then what was the purpose of this experiment, Dr. Richardson?" "Oh, we were just trying to find out a few basic facts about natural structure. Long ago, it was realized that the nucleonic particles, protons, neutrons, mesons, and so on, must have structure of their own. Since we started constructing negative proton matter, we found out a few things about nucleonic structure, some rather odd things, including fractions of Planck's constant. A couple of the correspondents, a man from La Prensa and an Australian, whistled softly. The others looked blank. Pitov took over. "You see, gentlemen, most of what we learned from putting negamatter atoms together. We annihilated a few of them. Over there in that little concrete building, we have one of the most massive steel vaults in the world where we do that. But we assembled millions of them for every one we annihilated, and that chunk of nega iron inside the magnetic bottle kept growing. And when you have a piece of negamatter you don't want, you can't just throw it out on the scrap pile. We might have rocketed it into an escape velocity and let it blow up in space, away from the moon or any of the artificial satellites. But why waste it? So we're going to have the rocket eject it, and when it falls, we can see by our telemetered instruments just what happens." "Well, won't it be annihilated by contact with atmosphere?" somebody asked. "That's one of the things we want to find out," Pitov said. "We estimate about 20% loss from contact with atmosphere, but the mass that actually lands on the target area should be about 40 kilos. It should be something of a spectacle coming down." "You say you had to assemble it after creating the negative protons and neutrons and the positrons. Doesn't any of this sort of matter exist in nature?" The man who asked that knew better himself. He just wanted the answer on the record. "Oh no, not on this planet, and probably not in the galaxy. There may be whole galaxies composed of nothing but negamatter. There may even be isolated stars and planetary systems inside our galaxy composed of negamatter, though I think that very improbable. But when negamatter and posimatter come into contact with one another, the result is immediate mutual annihilation." They managed to get away from the press and returned as far as the bunkers, 1.5 miles away. Before they went inside, Richardson glanced up at the sky, fixing the location of a few of the more conspicuous stars in his mind. There were almost 100 men and women inside. Each had his or her instruments, view screens, radar indicators, detection instruments of a dozen kinds. The reporters and telecast people arrived shortly afterward, and Eugenio Galvez took them in tow. While Richardson and Pitov were making their last minute's rounds, the countdown progressed past -1 hour, and at -20 minutes all the overhead lights went off, and the small instrument operator's lights came on. Pitov turned on a couple of view screens, one from a pickup on the roof of the bunker and another from the launching pad. They sat down side by side and waited. Richardson got his pipe out and began loading it. The loudspeaker was saying, "-2 minutes, 1:59, 58, 57. He let his mind drift away from the test, back to the world that had been smashed around his ears in the autumn of 1969. He was doing that so often now, when he should be thinking about 2 seconds, 1 second, firing. It was a second later that his eyes focused on the left-hand view screen. Red and yellow flames were gushing out at the bottom of the rocket, and it was beginning to tremble. Then the upper jets, the ones that furnished power for the generators, began firing. He looked anxiously at the meters. The generators were building up power. Finally, when he was sure that the rocket would be blasting off anyhow, the separator charges fired, and the heavy cables fell away. An instant later, the big missile started inching upward, gaining speed by the second, first slowly and jerkily, and then more rapidly, until it passed out of the field of the pickup. He watched the rising spout of fire from the other screen until it passed from sight. By that time, Pitov had twisted a dial and gotten another view of the left-hand screen, this time from close to the target. That camera was radar-controlled. It had fastened onto the approaching missile, which was still invisible. The stars swung slowly across the screen until Richardson recognized the ones he had spotted at the zenith. In a moment now, the rocket, 100 miles overhead, would be nosing down, and then the warhead would open, and the magnetic field inside would alter, and the mass of negamatter would be ejected. The stars were blotted out by a sudden glow of light. Even at 100 miles, there was enough atmospheric density to produce considerable energy release. Petrov, beside him, was muttering, partly in German and partly in Russian. Most of what Richardson caught was figures, trying to calculate how much of the mass of unnatural iron would get down for the ground blast. Then the right-hand screen broke into a wriggling orgy of color, and at the same time every scrap of radio-transmitted apparatus either went out or began reporting erratically. The left-hand screen, connected by wiring to the pickup on the roof, was still functioning. For a moment, Richardson wondered what was going on, and then shocked recognition drove that from his mind as he stared at the ever-brightening glare in the sky. It was the Auburn bomb again! He was back, in memory, to the night on the shore of Lake Ontario, the party breaking up in the early hours of morning. He and Janet and the people with whom they had been spending a vacation week standing on the lawn as the guests were getting into their cars. And then the sudden light in the sky, the cries of surprise, and then of alarm as it seemed to be rushing straight down upon them. He and Janet, clutching each other and staring up in terror at the falling blaze from which there seemed no escape. Then relief as it curved away from them and fell to the south. And then the explosion, lighting the whole southern sky. There was a similar explosion in the screen when the mass of nega iron landed, a sheet of pure white light, so bright and so quick as to almost pass above the limit of visibility, and then a moment's darkness that was in his stunned eyes more than in the screen, and then the rising glow of updrawn incandescent dust. Before the sound waves had reached them, he had been legging it into the house. The television had been on, and it had been acting as insanely as the screen on his right now. He had called the state police. The telephones had been working all right, and told them who he was, and they had told him to stay put, and they'd send a car for him. They did, within minutes. Janet and his host and hostess had waited with him on the lawn until it came, and after he had gotten into it, he had turned around and looked back through the rear window, and seen Janet standing under the front light, holding the little dog in her arms, flopping one of its silly little paws up and down with a hand to wave goodbye to him. He had seen her and the dog like that every day of his life for the last 15 years. "What kind of radiation are you getting?" he could hear Alexis Petrov asking into her phone. "What? Nothing else?" "Oh, yes, of course, but mostly cosmic. That shouldn't last long." He turned from the phone. "A devil's own dose of cosmic and some gamma. It was the cosmic radiation that put the radios and telescreens out. That's why I insisted that the drone planes be independent of radio control." They always got cosmic radiation from the micro-annihilations in the test vault. Well, now they had an idea of what produced natural cosmic rays. There must be quite a bit of negamatter and posimatter going into mutual annihilation and total energy release through the universe. Of course, there were no detectors set up in advance around Auburn, he said. We didn't really begin to find anything out for half an hour. By that time, the cosmic radiation was over, and we weren't getting anything but gamma. What has Auburn to do?" The Russian stopped short. You think this was the same thing? He gave it a moment's consideration. Lee, you're crazy. There wasn't an atom of artificial negamatter in the world in 1969. Nobody had made any before us. We gave each other some scientific surprises then, but nobody surprised both of us. You and I, between us, knew everything that was going on in nuclear physics in the world, and you know as well as I do. A voice came out of the public address speaker. Some of the radio equipment around the target area that wasn't knocked out by blast is beginning to function again. There is an increasingly heavy gamma radiation, but no more cosmic rays. They were all prompt radiation from the annihilation. The gamma is secondary effect. Wait a moment. Captain Urquiola of the Air Force said that the first drone plane is about to take off. It had been 2 hours after the blast that the first drones had gone over what had been Auburn, New York. He was trying to remember, as exactly as possible, what had been learned from them. Gamma radiation. A great deal of gamma. But it didn't last long. It had been almost down to a safe level by the time the investigation had been called off, and 2 months after there had been no more missiles, and no way of producing more, and no targets to send them against if they'd had them. Rather, he had been back at Auburn on his hopeless quest, and there had been almost no trace of radiation. Nothing but a wide, shallow crater, almost 200 feet in diameter, and only 15 at its deepest, already full of water, and a circle of flattened and scattered rubble for 1.5 miles all around it. He was willing to bet anything that that was what they'd find where the chunk of nega iron had landed, 50 miles away on the pampas. Well, the first drone ought to be over the target area before long, and at least one of the balloons that had been sent up was reporting its course by radio. The radios in the others were silent, and the recording counters had probably jammed in all of them. There'd be something of interest when the first drone came back. He dragged his mind back to the present and went to work with Alexis Petov. They were at it all night, checking, evaluating, making sure that the masses of data that were coming in were being promptly processed for programming the computers. At each of the increasingly frequent coffee breaks, he noticed Petov looking curiously. He said nothing, however, until long after dawn. They stood outside the bunker, waiting for the jeep that would take them back to their bungalow, and watching the line of trucks, Argentine army engineers, locally hired laborers, load after load of prefab huts and equipment, going down toward the target area where they would be working for the next week. Lee, were you serious? Petov asked. I mean, about this being like the one at Auburn. It was exactly like Auburn, even that blazing light that came rushing down out of the sky. I wondered about that at the time. What kind of a missile would produce an effect like that? Now I know. We just launched one like it. But that's impossible. I told you, between us, we know everything that was happening in nuclear physics then. Nobody in the world knew how to assemble atoms of negamatter and build them into masses. Nobody and nothing on this planet built that mass of negamatter. I doubt if it even came from this galaxy. But we didn't know that then. When that negamatter meteor fell, the only thing anybody could think of was that it had been a Soviet missile. If it had hit around Leningrad or Moscow or Kharkov, who would you have blamed it on? The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Smart Ones by Jack Sharkey. Originally published in Amazing Stories, February 1963. Narrated by Trussel. The first inkling came in a news bulletin that interrupted all regularly scheduled programming on the networks. Russia had uttered a flat or else at the UN Assembly, and the US had countered it with a steely "just try it." That was all. It might be bad, it might not be so bad. Par for the course, or this is it. The bulletin lasted 40 seconds. Then regular programming was resumed. No warnings, no repeats of the Conrad band numbers, no stay-tuned urgings, just the bulletin, then resumption of routine telecasts. Pete Crowlin turned to his wife, Beth. "What do you think?" he said, not having to specify his meaning further. A faint frown deepened the soft lines of her forehead. "I don't know," she said thoughtfully. "I think I'll call Lucille, see what she and Corey think." Her husband nodded, then lifted his beer and sipped it slowly, savouring the taste as though he might not have the chance again, his eyes returning to, but no longer witnessing, the western which the bulletin had interrupted. Beth rose from her chair, smoothed her dress, then made her way to the phone. Lucille's was a number Beth called at least once every day, but she had to look it up after dialing 2 wrong numbers. "Corey thinks so too," her friend said when Beth had told the reason for her call. "He's out checking the shelter. We've got plenty of water and food, but he thinks we need more books, just in case." "I wonder why we think this is it," Beth mused. "We both felt it, and I guess you and Corey did too. It's like that last straw on the camel's back, that kind of feeling." Lucille, however, was in no mood for philosophizing. "Corey's coming in, honey. I've got to help him with the books. I'll call back later." She gave a funny short laugh. "If there is a later." Lucille hung up. Pete had finished his beer and was standing beside the silent TV, staring at the wall when she returned. Beth took him by the arm, and he turned to face in her direction without resistance. "Pete," she said. Then louder, "Pete!" Some of the far-awayness cleared from his eyes, and he saw her. "Oh, what did Lucille have to say?" Beth gave a funny kind of smile and a half shrug. Pete nodded. "Them too. I guess I knew they'd feel it. Everybody will. I wonder how long we've got." His wife gripped his upper arms hard. "Listen," she said, "it's not too late yet. Lucille and Corey have told us 12 times to come in with them if things started blowing up. There's room. I have plenty of food so we won't infringe on theirs. Let's go over there now. Just in case." Pete wrenched away from her and shook his head violently. "No. I've told you over and over. I'm not going to prolong things. If the world blows itself up, I don't want to hang around for a few extra weeks to die in the wreckage of thirst or starvation. I'd as soon go when the world goes." Then his manner softened, and he took her gently by the shoulders. "But, honey, if you want to go with them, it's okay. I'll understand. Let me help you pack the car and—" Beth's hand came up in a blurred arc and cracked stingingly against the side of Pete's face. "Stop it!" she cried. "Stop talking that way. You know I won't go without you. What's left if you're gone?" Pete had to grip her wrists to stop the frantic tiny fists that pummeled his chest in angry affection. Okay, honey, I won't say it again. We'll stay here, together." He started to take her in his arms, then suddenly grinned and started turning around to face the other way. "In fact, we'll have a party," he said, shoving a kitchenwood. "Open that bottle of wine we've been saving for Thanksgiving dinner. We'll have it tonight, along with maybe some of that anchovy paste we bought and never tried, and—" "There's some cold chicken in the refrigerator," said his wife, catching his infectious enthusiasm. "And I think some onion dip and corn crisps." The peal of the front doorbell stopped them in the hall. "Lucille?" Pete asked his wife. Blankly she shrugged, then crossed the short foyer and opened the door. A young man in uniform burst in, his cap pushed crazily back on his short-cropped hair. "Pete, Beth, listen," he said. Did you hear the news bulletin?" "Martin," Pete said, shaken, "why aren't you at the base?" Martin Fennelly was a neighbour, a space reservist. "Dorothea's out in the car. We're headed there now. Come with us, please," begged the young officer. "Something is going to happen then," said Beth. "You bet your boots," said Martin. "Riots are starting all over the world. London, Chicago, Cairo. Any place with public shelters. People are trampling one another to get in." "But the newscasters didn't say," started Pete, simultaneously with Beth's halting. "Colonel Rudd isn't on the air." "Colonel Rudd," spat young Fennelly. "They know they use it. If they did, the panics would grow. Right now, there's still a chance of keeping some order. One warning to the populace, and the country becomes a mob 200 million strong." "Pete," Beth turned to stare up into his face, "what should we do?" Pete licked dry lips, then looked shrewdly at Fennelly. "What's at the base? Shelters?" "A ship," said Martin. "A spaceship. Never been tried or fully tested, but it's about the only real chance anyone has. I'm going, so's Dorothea, and 3 of my crewmen. The others are swiping jets to fly to their homes. They want to be with their families when the hell breaks loose." "But where's it flying to? Where can you go?" "Moon base," said Martin. "There's plenty of room, all the synthetic foods a person needs, oxygen generators, water recapturing systems. It's the nearest safe spot, as of that blow-up at the New End today." Beth turned a hopeful gaze to Pete. "Should we, darling? It's not like a shelter, like you were worried about. We don't have to come out and look for food in the rubble. We can live indefinitely on Moonbase. Please, darling, please." "I've got to think," said Pete, blinking. "It never occurred to me I'd have a third choice. I was resigned to sitting and waiting for the blast. Now, I'm all mixed up." "It's life Martin's offering us," pleaded Beth. "You can't turn down an offer of life, real survival." But is it?" asked Pete uncertainly. "We can't leave Moonbase any more than we could leave Corey's shelter. What difference if we're buried alive to avoid radiation or freezing vacuum?" "Pete, please," said Beth, almost screaming. "Damn it, Pete, make up your mind," snapped Martin. "I can't wait another minute. My wife's out in the car. She's trusting me to take her to safety." I won't go. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't want to leave. If I had time to think—" "All right," said Martin, starting for the door angrily. "Try to do a favour, risk your own life and—" Then he relented and rushed back to his neighbour. "Good luck, Pete," he said, gripping the older man's hand tightly. "Goodbye, Beth." No, wait," said Beth Crowlin, not daring to look at her husband's face as she rushed after the young man. "I'll come with you." Pete just stood like carven stone, watching, as Beth hurried down the front path into the night toward the waiting car. Martin, sick with embarrassment, turned a wryly apologetic grin Pete's way before following after her. When the sound of the engine faded in the distance, Pete finally managed to move and closed the door on the cold night outside. He went to the kitchen, stared hard at the bottle of wine in its corner of the pantry shelf, then yanked it down and smashed it to glittering bits in the sink. "Corey," complained Lucille, "you know you're not going to read Vanity Fair or Coningsby. You started them 100 times and always lost interest. We could use the space for 100 better things." Corey shoved the books doggedly back into the slot from which his wife had taken them on the bookshelf, then set his back stubbornly against them, glaring at her. "Those are records," he said, fighting an urge to shout. "The Society of Thackeray's Time, the British school system of Disraeli's. Some day our children will want to know what the world was like before the disaster." "Why?" said his wife. "What they don't know won't hurt them. They'll never wonder about it if you don't prod them to. And why should they know about Vanity Fair and Coningsby anyhow? You've survived this long without knowing." All right, snarled Corey, whirling to the shelf and pulling books out by the handful. "Fill the space with Wheaties or movie magazines, a home permanence in lipstick. To hell with our children's minds." "Corey, stop it!" hollered Lucille, trying to pick the books from the shelter floor as he hurled them there, then giving up and simply trying to pin his flailing arms. His elbow struck her in the chest, and she fell back with a startled grunt. Corey, his face white, started toward her with words of remorse on his lips, then tripped ingloriously upon the heaped volumes and sprawled on his face at her feet. Lucille sank into a chair as he rose groggily on hands and knees and began to laugh. Corey, after a second, began to match her laughter with his own. Then he frowned and stopped. Her laughter was all wrong. He took her by the shoulders and shook her, but she kept on laughing while the tears ran down her contorted face. "You should have told me," moaned Martin on his knees beside the metal and nylon cot. Dorothea just groaned and tossed her head from side to side on the sweat-soaked pillow, fighting the restraining straps. "Surprise," she mumbled, her features white with agony. "I wanted it to be a surprise." "But," her husband sobbed, beating his fists futilely against the steel bulkhead, "didn't you know the take-off would be like that? Haven't I told you how many grown men have died of internal hemorrhages from the gravities they had to resist during take-off? Didn't you suspect that you—" He stopped and sagged, his head resting against the frame of her bunk, and just sobbed softly, uselessly, while his wife murmured over and over, like a fragment of intolerably sad music, "My baby, my little baby, my poor baby." Pete sat in a thick muddling fog, his fingers fumbling with paper and glue, sniffling softly in his misery. He didn't hear the light footsteps on the porch, nor the familiar voice, until his name was called for the third time. Then he started, guiltily, and began to try and hide what he held clumsily on his lap. Beth came into their bedroom and saw him, and what he was trying to do. The empty beer cans, the shattered glass upon the carpeted floor, and the ragged tear in the wallpaper between bureau and closet told her what he'd done. "I don't blame you," she said softly, cupping her hand gently about the back of his neck. Pete suddenly choked on his tears and flung his arms about her thighs, burying his face hard against her abdomen. "I was so mad at you," he said between spasms of relieved weeping. "I came up here, drinking, saw the wedding picture on the wall, smashed the glass, and—" Beth looked at the wedding photo where it had fallen in two curling halves upon the floor, and smiled. "But you tried to fix it again," she said softly. "Of course I tried to fix it," he muttered, keeping his face close against the warm softness of her belly. "I got mad, but I got over it." "Me too," said Beth. "A mile from the house I screamed for Martin to let me out of the car. I had to walk back. No one's bothering to run the buses anymore. I saw the wine in the sink. Is there any beer left?" He nodded mutely, still holding her tightly. "Then we can still have our party," she said decisively. "Maybe not so fancy as we'd planned, but—" Then her husband was surging to his feet and stilling her lips with the hungry pressure of his own. Hours before the spaceship reached Moonbase, the men stationed there saw the horror begin. The orb of Earth, silver and blue against the black void of space, began to erupt with tiny bubbles of orange and white, faster and faster, until the shapes of the continents were limned against the steady blue glow of the oceans. Then the fringe of the oceans began to billow white, rolling clouds of steam, and the planet shrouded itself in impenetrable heaving seas of angry white vapour. Some common tacit urging made the men continue with their jobs there, go through the routine of scanning the universe, radioing reports to stations long since molten piles of slag, metering the water and precious oxygen that kept them alive. No one wanted to talk of what they'd seen. Life went on for many hours as though nothing untoward had happened. Then, when the last strained thread of control was fraying madly, the spaceship landed with its 5-person complement. "More mouths to feed," said the Moonbase commander, looking out through the port at the space-suited figures moving clumsily toward the airlock. I don't know if we should let them in. Even if it's the president, I don't know. Sir, said an aide, look there in the lead, the small one, leaning on the arm of another one. I think it's a woman. The commander's eyes hooded for a moment. Then he turned to his aide and said, Let her in. Before the others, you mean, sir? Asked the man. Let her in. Period. Sir, said the aide, his voice shaking, you're not thinking of... We've been here for 3 months without a woman, Captain, said the commander. This may be the last one alive in the cosmos. I'm not sure the man with her would agree to sharing her. But the others, they can't live out there for more than a few hours in their spacesuits. But the commander had picked up a book of crossword puzzles and was concentrating fiercely on a cryptogram. The other man swallowed noisily once, then went to carry out the orders. It's over, said Corey to his wife. Lucille nodded dully. Don't you understand, honey? The bombing stopped, and we're still alive. Enough food for months. The radiation count will be down by then, and... And what? Asked Lucille, staring from her husband's face to the 2 children sleeping on the military cot before the crowded bookshelf. When it's down, what happens next? Why, we go out, we rebuild. Rebuild? Rebuild what? How? Said Lucille. Can you build a radio? If you could, who would we talk to, listen to? I mean, rebuild houses, start farming, raise animals. Will the land grow food any more? Are there animals left out there, or did they forget to burrow underground when the fires began? Said Lucille. Be reasonable, honey, said Corey. That's what I'm being, for the first time in years, she said. I wish we'd stayed with Pete and Beth. They've turned to ashes by now, said Corey. Lucille shrugged. Maybe they're better off. The baby began to cry and kick its round pink legs. I think the baby needs a change or something, said Corey, looking down at his infant son. Read him Coningsby, said Lucille. Then she started laughing again, until Corey was forced to slap her face crimson to quiet her. Just a few weeks short of 2 years after the Holocaust, the great spaceship settled on faltering fires to the charred surface of the Earth. The moon-base commander, gaunt from long starvation, reeled out into the glaring white sunlight, fell face downward upon the sharp black rocks, and just lay there, trying to catch his breath. Behind him, a pale shadow formed in the blackness of the open airlock, and a woman crept out, her hair tangled and white-streaked, her face raddled with disease. She shuddered and sank to a squatting position on the ground, covering her face with her hands to block out the horrible vista that ran for mile upon scorched mile. It's dead. The world's dead, she mewled, quaking. We're at a wake. A hideous, horrible wake. The commander groaned and lifted himself up painfully on his elbows. There's got to be something, somewhere, or we've had it. It's your fault, said the woman. What did you expect the men to do when you kept me to yourself? You shared me with them nearly 2 years. You shouldn't have locked the men out of your quarters. I was drunk, the commander said bitterly. I didn't think they'd go berserk, wreck the synthesizers, fight among themselves. I had a husband once, said the woman. You let him freeze to death, suffocate, all because he would have wanted to keep me for himself. You turned around and did the same thing. Musingly, she eyed a large, jagged stone, lifted it in her hand, and approached the weary, sprawling form on the ground. If he deserved to die, why not you? That was different, said the commander. I'd have shared you when I sobered up. He'd never... He hadn't time for even a gasp as the woman brought the stone down with both hands upon the nape of his neck, shattering the bone beneath the thin flesh there. He fell forward, drooling blood on the sun-baked black rock. "No," said the woman, brushing her hands firmly against her thighs to cleanse them of the feel of the rock. "Martin would never. That's why I loved him." Tiredly, she began to walk, away from the ship and the memories of degradation it held for her, out across the hot, blazing plains of arid rock, humming a lilting waltz that had been played at her high school prom. When she could walk no further, she lay down on the rock, rolled onto her back, and smiled emptily at the stark blue skies overhead until unconsciousness stole over her. 100 miles away, a naked boy knelt before a cairn of rock, frowning in concentration, his tongue tucked against the corner of his mouth as he carefully arranged smooth red pebbles before the cairn until their design pleased him. Under the cairn lay a steel and concrete door, and within the chamber beyond it lay the mummified bodies of his parents and siblings, as he'd found them when he was old enough to crawl. He was walking now, pretty well for his 15 months of life. He could only judge his progress by the progress of others like him, children conceived amid the radiation and gene-mutating chaos of those first months in the shelters. He had determined to be a leader. He didn't know the word leader, of course, but he would soon coin a sound that conveyed that meaning to himself and the others. He didn't know why his parents were dead, or the parents of the others like himself. Perhaps one always died when one reached a certain age. Still, why had his brother and sister died then, since they had so much growing to do before they matched that of his parents? He shrugged away the problem, finished his arrangement of coloured stones, and stood up to consider them. They would do nicely, he decided. They would prettify the spot where his ancestry lay buried, here amid the rocky splendours of such a lovely, incredibly beautiful planet. He scowled suddenly, deciding that the patterns of stones held one red rock too many. Carefully he removed it. He sent a short series of affectionate thoughts toward the departed souls of his family, then turned away from the cairn and began to toddle across the burning black rock toward the area housing the shelters of the other children. He was tired of mourning for the day. Besides, the other kids were considering building a structure to keep off the infrequent hot rains, and he thought he knew a way to support the roof which no one else had yet considered. Thinking hard as he moved toward the community area, he tossed the coloured pebble up and down absently in one hand, then popped it into his mouth and chewed it up with relish. It was only an appetizer. For dinner, at sunset, he had his eye on a rainbow outcropping of quartz. It should be delicious. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Not a Creature Was Stirring, by Dean Evans. Originally published in Galaxy, December 1951. Narrated by Tom Trussel. He was a tall, hard man with skin the colour of very old iodine. When he climbed up out of the vertical shaft of his small gold mine, the lousy disappointment, he could have been taken for an Indian, he was that dark. Except, of course, that Indians didn't exist anymore in 1982. His name was Tom Gannett, and he was about 40 years old, and he didn't realize his own uniqueness. When he made it to his feet, the first thing he did was to squint up at the sun. The second was to sneeze, and the third to blow his nose. "Hey, you old son," he growled. "You old crummy son, you look sicker than a dog." Which was literally true, for the sun seemed to be pretty queer. The whole sky seemed to be pretty queer, for that matter. Skies should be blue, and the sun should be a bloated golden bauble drifting serenely across them. But the skies were not blue. They were a dirty purplish grey, and the sun wasn't a bloated golden bauble. Somebody had it by the scruff of the neck and was dragging it. Gannet planted his big feet wide apart and frowned sourly around and sniffed the air like a dog at a gopher hole. "The damn world smells sick," he grunted. Which was also true. The world did smell sick. The world smelled something like that peculiar odour that comes from an old graveyard carefully tended by an old man with dank moss sticking to the soles of his old shoes. That kind of smell. Gannet didn't know why the sun looked sick, and he didn't know why the world smelled sick. Indeed, there were many things Gannet didn't know, among which would be these in particular. A. He did not know, since for the last 6 months he had been living and working all alone at his little mine, which was in the remotest of the most remote desert regions of Nevada, that a little less than 3 weeks earlier mankind had finally achieved the inevitable, man's own annihilation. B. He did not know that he was going to be the loneliest man on earth. He was used to, and perfectly content with, the hermit-like existence of a desert rat. C. He furthermore did not know that there were 4 of the 10 commandments which he wasn't going to be able to break any more, not even if he stayed up nights trying and lived for centuries. Gannet snorted the smell from his nostrils and shrugged. Hell with it. He thought about Reno, and now he hadn't been there for nearly a year. He thought of the dimly lighted, soft-carpeted cocktail lounges in Reno, where drinks come in long-stemmed glasses and blondes in long-stemmed legs. Reno at Christmas time, he thought. There was a town. Reno. He grinned, showing big gold teeth that blazed out of his mouth like the glittering grill on a Buick. He dug his feet into the hard ground and walked the 100 feet or so to his cabin, where he sometimes slept when he didn't happen to sleep in the mine. He stripped off his grime-sodden clothes. He stepped out of them, in fact, and stretched luxuriously as though he hadn't felt the good joy of being unclothed for a long time. He got up and went to a corner of the cabin, rummaged out a pair of dusty clogs, and pushed his feet into them. Then, and they don't come any nakeder than he was, he went outside and around the shack to the rear, where he kept his jeep and where the shower was. He stepped into it, for it was nothing more ornate than a large oil drum suspended on long 4x6s. He yanked on a rope that hung down from the drum. The result of doing that made him leap out again, dripping wet and colder than a buried mother-in-law. He shivered, eyes blinking fast. He took a deep breath. His gold teeth went together tightly, and the big muscles in his neck corded defensively. He deliberately went under the shower again. Pouring a sliver of laundry soap from a ledge on one of the 4x6s, he went to work with it, and when he finally tripped the hanging rope once more, he was a clean man. He went into the cabin. It wasn't any warmer than the great outdoors, but that was where his clothes were. He shaved from an old granite basin full of cold water. After that, he went to a hook on the wall and got down a suit of clothes which looked as though it had shriveled up waiting for somebody to wear it. The last thing he did before leaving was to pry up one of the boards behind the door and lift out of this hiding place a small leather bag. The bag was filled with gold. The sun was gone now. Leg-like rays of light still sprawled, dirty-looking, in the sky over toward the California line, but aside from these extremities, most of it was somewhere out in the Pacific. The purplish sky was darker now, drab, dead somehow. The old jeep started nicely. It always started nicely. That was one of the good things about a Jeep. The only funny thing was that out of its exhaust pipe in the rear came angry purplish flames. Queer flames. Gannett stared at them, surprised. "Even the damn Jeep is sick," he muttered. He was wrong, of course, but he had no way of knowing that. He backed around, finally, and went down what he called his driveway, which was little more than rock-strewn ground, until he came to a small dirt road. This led him to another, larger dirt road, which in turn led him to route number 395, which was a U.S. highway. 100 miles farther on, he came to the outskirts of Carson City. It wasn't until he pulled into a gas station that he realized something was wrong. Nobody jumped out to wipe his windshield. The attendant, who still leaned in the doorway of the station, had a rag in his hand, but he didn't budge. He couldn't. His face looked like weathered leather, and he was dead. "Holy!" whispered Gannett incredulously. He forgot about needing gas. He jumped in the Jeep and drove down the main stem and found police headquarters in an old grey stone building. He knew it was police headquarters, for the green neon over the revolving door had CPD on it, and it was still burning. He went up the steps 2 at a time, banged through the swinging doors, and stamped straight to where the sergeant sat at a desk over in the corner by the switchboard. "Hey, by God!" yelled Gannett to the desk sergeant. "There's a guy down the street in a gas station, and he's standing up in the doorway and he's dead as a mackerel." Dramatic words. But the desk sergeant was no longer among the living and didn't appreciate them. It took Gannett a long while to get over that. He slowly backed away. He made the big oak doors, still backing. He went down the stairs on legs as stiff as icicles. He got back in his Jeep and started up again. He knew there was something terribly wrong, but before he thought about it, he knew he had to have a drink. He pulled up in front of a saloon that had nice, cheery, glowing lights showing through the big front window. He got out of the Jeep. He went through the swinging glass doors and straight to the bar. "Scotch!" Nobody answered. The barman behind the mahogany, facing him, didn't make a move. The barman had a dead cigarette between his cold, colourless lips. The cigarette had a half-inch of ash on it. The ash looked as though it was sculptured out of purple marble. Gannett put both hands flat on the bar and swallowed hard. He twisted his head and looked over the shoulder of a customer on his left, who was leaning negligently on the bar with one elbow. There was a half-full bottle in front of the leaning man, and it had an alert-looking horse's head stuck in the neck of it for a pouring spout. "Excuse me, Mac," Gannett whispered. The leaning man didn't twitch a muscle. Gannett sucked in a deep breath. He reached. He got the bottle. He blinked stupidly at the bottle, and then he put it down very carefully and took another breath and looked at a highball glass in front of the leaning man. The highball glass was empty and clean, but the leaning man's fingers were curled lightly and gracefully around it. They were nice fingers, white fingers, fingers that looked as if they hadn't had to do any hard work lately. Slender, tapering, carefully manicured fingers. Gannett swore softly. He yanked the horse's head out and then poked the bottle into his mouth and tilted it up. He held it until there wasn't anything left by the very glass it was made of, plus the bright little paper label. His throat burned. He coughed. He banged the empty bottle down on the bar top and coughed again, hard. The leaning man stirred, seemed to turn slowly, stiffly, in a half-arc that put him face to face with Gannett. Then he went down backward, and all in one piece, like a tall tree on top of a hill on a very still night. He went down with a glass in his hand, and when he hit, swirls of thick dust rose lazily from the floor and then settled back over his rigid form like freshly falling snow blanketing something left out on the front lawn. The night was black. There wasn't a star, and there wasn't a sound, except for earth sounds, which are never very loud. Gannett sat in his jeep with the motor running and the purple flames coming out of the tailpipe. His hands were tight around the wheel, but the jeep wasn't moving. Gannett was staring off into space, and his eyes looked as though somebody had peeled them back. He said it to himself mentally for the first few times. Then, as if he couldn't contain them any longer, the words tumbled out of his mouth into the night air. "Everybody's dead, by God!" He drove through deserted streets until he found an all-night drugstore. It didn't seem funny to him just yet that the streets were deserted. That was something he would think of later. He walked into the drugstore and went to the newsstand and picked up a copy of the Carson Daily Bugle. The date struck him first. It was the wrong date. It was 3 weeks ago. He dropped it and picked up another, a Reno paper this time. Same trouble with the date. He read the headline then. "Reds strike at Turkey. Unveil new weapon." He blinked at it. There was a little more, pitifully little, to the effect that Congress had been asked for a declaration of war in order to defend the assaulted member of the Atlantic Pact nations. Gannett swallowed hard. He dropped the paper and turned to the clerk who was leaning over the glass counter watching him. "Geez," Gannett said, "when did all this happen? I didn't even know about it." He didn't get any answer from the clerk. He knew he wouldn't from the way the clerk's eyes looked. They looked as if they should have been under refrigeration. "People around dead," he muttered. "By God, the governor ought to know about this." He left the drugstore and drove straight for the state capitol building, which wasn't far away, for Carson City isn't very large. He walked up the long concrete ribbon to the big stone steps. He mounted them. He stood before the bronze doors for an instant, a feeling of awe coming over him despite what he knew he was going to tell the governor. He pulled on the handle of the nearest of the bronze doors. Nothing happened. It was locked, of course. The Capitol is never open at 3 a.m., which was the exact time when it had happened 3 weeks ago, but he didn't know that. A feeling of rage came over Gannett slowly, like heat radiating through soft wood. He stood on the stone steps and faced the broad expanse of lawn, which in the summertime at least was very lovely. He slowly pulled his leather bag of gold from his coat pocket and raised it up so he could see it. Then he turned once more to the bronze doors and smashed the bag of gold through one of the glass panes. "Gannett done it," he roared. "If anybody wants to know, tell him Gannett, by God." He went back to his jeep. The big, darkly hulking form of the red brick post office building went by and faded into the night. He passed a jewelry store. He looked in. An electric mantel clock in the store window indicated the time as 9:10. He passed a supermarket. The big illuminated clock on the facade said 9:07. The clock in the service station, where he finally pulled in for gas, pointed at 9 exactly. Cycles have to be controlled if electric clocks are to keep correct time, but that was something else he did not know. After he put back the gasoline hose, he left one more observation on the silence on the night before driving to Reno. He said it loudly, and there was angry frustration in every word of it. "Hell with Carson City! To hell with it!" Approaching downtown Reno at night is a pleasant, cheerful experience. There are lights all around, like a store selling electric fixtures. On the right-hand side of Virginia Street, they glow brightly, each one a little gaudier than the last. Big lights. Neon lights in all the colors neon lights can come in. Signs on the fronts of the big gaming houses that stay open until lights aren't needed anymore, and the one flash of light across Virginia Street at the intersection of Commercial Row, which had been photographed more times than the mind of man could have conjectured. Reno, the biggest little city in the world. He drove slowly by the Happy Times Club. He could see quite a few people inside. You wouldn't think there was anything wrong when you looked at something like that. At the corner of First Street, he stopped for the signal. He pulled around a military vehicle that seemed to be waiting for the signal too. It was an open vehicle, painted the olive drab of the army, and sitting stiffly erect behind the wheel was a natty-looking first lieutenant with his cap at just the right angle over one eye. The signal bell up on the corner poles clanged loudly, and the lights turned green. Gannett crossed the intersection, but the lieutenant and his military vehicle stayed behind. He went by the Golden Bubble, which was perhaps the largest and gaudiest of all the gaming places in Reno. Its big front, done in glass bricks with multicolored lights behind them, looked like some monstrous kaleidoscope built for the use of the man in the moon. Seen from his jeep, through the plate glass of the wide door, the interior of the Golden Bubble seemed to be a happy carousing place full of the joyous laughter of folks having a fine time. Only that wasn't so, of course, for the only sounds to be heard were the jeep's motor and the signal bells on the corner poles. Gannett parked. He walked back, went slowly through the doors of the Golden Bubble. The first thing that met his eyes was the flashing welcome grin of the head waiter, who was dressed in a tuxedo just inside the doors. The head waiter had his hand half out, as if to shake the hand of Gannett as he came in. Gannett almost stuck out his own hand in return, but not quite. He went to the bar. He didn't look at the barman lying on the floor with his ears in the spittoon. He shambled around the end of the bar, took a full bottle of scotch off the back bar shelf, broke the seal, and took a long swallow. The bartender didn't notice. After that, he took the bottle with him out on the floor. He went around a man in an overcoat who looked to be uncomfortably warm but wasn't. He went over to a roulette table and stared the croupier straight in the eyes. He reached for a pile of chips under the croupier's right hand and slid them over. 00, he said. The croupier looked bored, which was the way a croupier should look. Gannett reached down and gave the wheel a spin and then stood back and waited. The croupier waited. 2 women and 1 man, on Gannett's right, also waited. The ball clicked merrily, came to a stop. The wheel slowed, finally rested. It wasn't 00. Gannett reached for the croupier's rake and shoved his pile of chips back under the croupier's protecting right hand. "Lousy wheel is fixed," Gannett said. Nobody argued with him on that. He uncorked his scotch bottle and took a long pull. Nobody objected to that either. The croupier still looked bored, and the 2 women and the 1 man waited patiently for the day of judgment. Gannett went over to a cashier window and reached in and got a handful of silver dollars. He took them to the machines over against the far wall and stuck in a couple and pulled the 2 handles simultaneously. For his investment, he got back $5, which one of the machines disgorged with a loud clatter. He put more dollars in. He put them in fast and pulled the levers fast. He went down the entire row of machines and pulled the levers as he went. He didn't linger to see what happened at any of them. He began to feel cold. He took out his scotch bottle again and half emptied it. A woman who looked as if she were someone's great-grandmother, except that her hair was bleached and fingernails were sharp talons, and who sat in a chrome and leather chair not 6 feet away from him, stared a little disapprovingly. Gannett caught the look. "Lady," he said defensively, "I earn me holiday, see? It's none of your business if I do some celebrating, is it?" The lady didn't change her mind. She looked as though she might prefer gin herself. Gannett belched. He wasn't so cold now. He threw back his head and laughed, and listened to the sound of it bounce off walls. He did it again. He was feeling fine. He went back to the roulette wheel, got around behind it, and nudged the croupier gently. The croupier went over like a broom sliding down the side of a wall. Gannett picked up the little plastic rake and looked at the two women and one man. "Place your bets, folks," he said in a low tone that was a pretty good imitation of the drone of a professional man. He separated the chips into 4 neat piles. He pushed a pile each at the two women, one to the man. The last he kept for himself. "Place your bets, folks," he repeated. Nobody did, but that was okay anyhow. Grinning happily, he made bets for them. One of the women, the one that was red-headed, looked to him as if she might be a plunger. He shoved her pile of chips over onto 0, and then he gave her a friendly little wink. The other woman was the careful type, he thought. Her chips, not all of them of course, he shoved for red. He disposed of the man perfunctorily. $10 on plain number 9. His own bet was due a little more deliberation. He carefully spread around $500 until the strip looked as if 18 people were playing it all at once. The effort made him sweat. He reached for his bottle, emptied it, then dropped it on the fallen croupier. "Folks," Gannett said in an apologetic tone, "you'll have to pardon me for a minute. It seems like I'm out of fuel. Don't go away. I'll be right back." Everybody was agreeable. Gannett went back to the bar, went around behind it. He said to the barman, "I got a party out here, Doc. A big party, see? The house might stand to make a mint. How's about drinks?" The barman considered it. The barman was still considering it when Gannett went back to the wheel with a 5th of scotch and 4 glasses and a dish of olives. He made drinks. In each one he put an olive. By this time, of course, he was getting a little loud, but nobody could blame him for that. When the drinks were made and placed before the two women and the man, he was ready. He grinned around, rubbed his hands together, and winked a sly little leering wink at the redhead. The wheel spun, stopped. 0. The redhead had brought down the house. "By God!" whispered Gannett in frank admiration. "Lady, you sure got luck. Another little snifter just to nail it tight?" Gannett liked the idea. He drank her drink for her and made a face over the olive. He poured another. He made more bets for everybody and then thought of something. Excusing himself once more, he got a roll of quarters from the cashier cage and, breaking it open, fed them into a big glittering jukebox over in the corner. That done, he pushed down a row of tabs and went back to the table. Everybody seemed to be having a time. The redhead just couldn't lose. 3 separate times Gannett was forced to collect chips from other tables in order to keep the game going, but he didn't mind. He even said to the redhead once, "Lady, 10 more minutes and we sign the joint over to you. But have fun. You're doing swell." Once more he consulted the thoughtful barman, and more than once he had to go back to the jukebox and punch tabs. But that was all right. He liked music. At 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, with all the chips in the place before the lucky redhead, he finished his last bottle. He lifted his eyes and considered a crystal chandelier which hung from the exact centre of the broad ceiling. It was a beautiful chandelier. It looked as though it might have graced the banquet hall of some castle over in England, back in the days when England was a tight little isle. He grinned appreciatively at it. He pitched the empty bottle upward. There was a crash. Half the lights in the place went out. Bowing solemnly to the scattered immobile figures, Gannett lurched to the big door up front. He tried to bow to the friendly floorman, but it didn't quite go over. He banged through the doors and out into the street. Gannett groaned his aching body out of bed and padded heavily to the window. He put his big hands on the sill and looked out. Purple snow was falling on a quiet world. The flakes came down softly, big, wet, coloured things like fluffy bits of cotton candy escaping from a circus in the sky. There was his jeep down on the street where he had left it. He could recognize it, for it was the only jeep on the block. "Then it wasn't no lousy dream," he said miserably. He went back to the bed and sat down on the edge of it. He recalled the headlines in the paper. "Them lousy Reds," he whispered. "They done this, sure as hell." That made him think a little. Everybody was dead. Even the redhead in the golden bubble who couldn't lose. "What the hell am I doing alive then?" he asked himself. There was no answer to that. He thought of his mine, the lousy disappointment, and wondered if, living most of the time below the surface as he did, he had been protected from some sort of purple gas or something that seemed to have killed off everybody else. It could be. Some very light gas, maybe, that wouldn't seep below the surface. "Oh, for cripe's sakes," he grunted disgustedly. He dressed and left the room. He went downstairs. There was a lobby, all soft, quiet carpeting, and soft, quiet furniture, and soft, quiet drapes. A sheet of paper on a writing desk said Grand Pachapa. He was in a hotel then. He must have wandered into it after he left the golden bubble. He carefully avoided looking at two well-dressed women who sat in lobby chairs staring off into nothing, but he felt their presence chillingly. He shivered. He made his way outside, the purple snow coming down and giving his cheeks wet, cold caresses. He angrily brushed them off, but they came down anyway. Above the snow, the sky was a sodden mass of purplish grey. He found a restaurant that was open. A few customers sat on the stools like statues in a museum. All the coffee makers were on the electric stove, but they were dry and clean, except one that had no bottom in it any more and was quite discoloured. Beneath it, the round electric coil still glowed faithfully. He grabbed up one of the clean pots and took it to the metal rinse sink and reached for the faucet. And then his hand froze. What if the water was tainted? He had no way of finding out if it didn't carry that identifying purplish tint. He tried the faucet. It did. The milk in the refrigerator was 3 weeks old, of course. Gannett ended by opening a bottle of Pepsi-Cola for breakfast. The sky stayed leaden, but even so there were many things apparent now that he hadn't seen the night before. A lack of heavy traffic on the streets would seem to indicate that what had happened, purple gas or whatever, had been very late at night. Even so, traffic accidents were everywhere. There was one big sedan with its front end crushed against the First Olympic Bank. There was one cop who had died trying to tie his right shoe. His fingers still clutched the laces. There was a doctor, his car had a caduceus emblem on the windshield, who had just stepped down to the street, his bag in his left hand and his right hand on the door, ready to slam it shut. He had a serious, purposeful look on his face that even the falling purple snow couldn't quite eradicate. Despite the cold, sweat frosted Gannett's forehead. He made his way to a radio and television store and kicked in a glass panel of the front door. Stepping through to the clamour of the suddenly aroused night warning bell, he went directly to a TV set and turned it on. The big screen tube flickered after a while, and a scratching hum came out of the speaker, but nothing happened. He tried all the channels. Nothing. He tuned in a big radio console next, going carefully and slowly across the dial with a hand that shook. Even though the night warning bell was kicking up quite a racket, he could tell after a moment or two. Nothing. The sky was getting dark as Gannett left the store. The purple snow still fell. It was then that he noticed for the first time the gay street decorations in preparation for Christmas. Big paper bells with plenty of glittering tinsel and electric lamps inside them. On the corner of First and Virginia, he saw a big iron kettle of some Salvation Army Santa. Hanging from its metal tripod, it looked quite natural, except that it was filled with purple snow, and the Santa who was supposed to ring his little bell was holding it stiffly over his head. He and the bell were frozen silent. There was a large department store. Inside, in the show window, was a Christmas display that would delight the kiddies. There was a big Christmas tree trimmed with every imaginable ornament. Beneath the tree, electrically activated toy soldiers jerked robot-like through their precise military designations, their lithographed faces looking stern and very brave. There was a clown who did uncounted somersaults, a lifelike doll who clapped her hands in glee. There was an aluminium bomber with a wingspread of 3 feet. It was held in the air by almost invisible wires, and its 6 propellers droned in perfect unison, making a brisk little wash that rustled the silk of the little doll's dress. And around the base of the tree, through valley and over mountain, into tunnel and over spider-web trestle, was a railroad track. It should have had busy little trains on it, except that it didn't. The trains had been derailed at a whistle stop called North Pole. Gannett's eyes twitched. The sky grew darker. The purple snow continued to fall silently. Gannett went by the Masonic Lodge, the YMCA, and crossed the little stone bridge over the frozen Truckee River. He came to the heavy grey stone building of First Community Church. He stopped in front of the church and stared at it. It was a solid, respectable-looking building. It was a very nice thing, indeed, to have here in Reno. "Christmas Eve," Gannett whispered through cold lips. "This is Christmas Eve!" He went up 6 purple snow-covered stone steps. He reached the top where the stone steps ended and where the big square stone slab was. That slab where the minister stands when the weather is fair and shakes hands with the congregation after the service. Somewhere above, in the steeple, bells struck off the hour of 8. A timing device did that. Many churches had such timing devices to save labor, and as though that were a signal, a loudspeaker, attached way up on the spire, especially for this festive season, began to growl out preparatory scratching noises, like a big metal monster clearing its throat. Gannett pulled on the wrought brass handles of the closed oaken door. The door didn't budge. He grabbed the handles in both hands and braced his feet. He pulled hard. The door was locked. "God," he whispered hoarsely. "God, this is me. I gotta get in. God, listen. I gotta get in." High above, in the steeple, the loudspeaker was finally ready with a cheerful little carol. "God rest ye merry gentlemen." The voices of a dead choir roared out upon the silent city. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Flight Through Tomorrow by Stanton A. Coblentz. Originally published in Fantasy Book, Volume 1, Number 1, 1947. Narrated by Tom Trussel. 1. Nothing was further from my mind when I discovered the release drug, Relin, than the realization that it would lead me through as strange and ghastly and revealing a series of adventures as any man has ever experienced. I encountered it, in a way, as a mere byproduct of my experiments. I am a chemist by profession, and as one of the staff of the Morgenstern Foundation have access to some of the best equipped laboratories in America. The startling new invention, I must call it that, though I did not create it deliberately, came to me in the course of my investigations into the obscure depths of the human personality. It has long been my theory that there is in man a psychic entity which can exist for at least brief periods apart from the body, and have perceptions which are not those of the physical senses. In accordance with these views, I had been developing various drugs, compounded of morphine and adrenaline, whose object was to shock the psychic entity loose for limited periods, and so to widen the range and powers of the personality. I shall not go into the details of my researches, nor tell by what accident I succeeded better than I had hoped. The all-important fact, a fact so overwhelming that I shudder and gasp and marvel even as I tell of it, is that I did obtain a minute quantity of a drug which, by putting the body virtually in a state of suspended animation, could release the mind to travel almost at will across time and space. Yes, across time and space. For the drag of the physical having been stricken off, I could enter literally into infinity and eternity. But let me tell precisely what happened that night when at precisely 10:08, in the solitude of my apartment room, I swallowed half an ounce of Relin and stretched myself out on the bed, well knowing that I was taking incalculable risks, and that insanity and even death were by no means remote possibilities of the road ahead. But let that be as it may. In my opinion, there is no coward more despicable than he who will not face danger for the sake of knowledge. My head reeled, and something seemed to buzz inside it as soon as the bitter half-ounce of fluid slipped down my throat. I was barely able to reach the bed and throw myself upon it when there came a snapping as of something inside my brain. Then, for a period, blankness. Then a gradual awakening with that feeling of exhilaration one experiences only after the most blissful sleep. I opened my eyes, feeling strong and light of limb, and charged with a marvellous vital energy. But, as I peered about me, my lips drew far apart in astonishment, and I am sure that I gaped like one who has seen a ghost. Where were the familiar walls of my 2x4 room, the bureau, the book-rack, the ancient portrait of Pasteur that hung in its glass frame just above the foot of the bed? Gone. Vanished as utterly as though they had never been. I was standing on a wide and windy plain, with a gale beating in my ears, and with rapid sunset-coloured clouds scudding across the blood-stained west. Mingled with the wailing of the blast there was a deep sobbing sound that struck me in successive waves, like the ululations of great multitudes of far-off mourners. And while I was wondering what this might mean, and felt a prickling of horror along my spine, the first of the portents swept across the sky. I say portents, for I do not know by what other term to describe the apparitions. High in the heavens, certainly at an altitude of many miles, the flaming thing swept across my view, comet-shaped and stretching over at least 10 degrees of arc, swift as a meteor, brilliantly flash-red, sputtering sparks like an anvil, and leaving behind it a long ruddy tail that only slowly faded out amid the darkening skies. It must have been a full minute after its disappearance before the hissing of its flight came to my ears. A hissing so sharp, so nastily insistent, that it reached me even above the noise of the wind. And more than another minute had passed before the earth beneath me was wrenched and jarred as if by an earthquake, and the most thunderous detonations I had ever heard burst over me in a prolonged series. Let me emphasize that none of this had the quality of a dream. It was clear-cut, as vivid as anything I had ever experienced, My mind worked with an unusual precision and clarity, and not even a fleeting doubt came to me of the reality of my observations. This is some sort of bombing attack, I remember reflecting, some assault of super-monsters of the skies, perfected by a super-science. And I did not have to be told the fact. I knew, as by an all-illuminating inner knowledge, that I had voyaged into the future. Even as this realization came to me, I made another flight, and one that was in space more than in time. It did not surprise me, but I took it as the most natural thing in the world when I seemed to rise and go floating away through the air. It was still sunset time, but I could see clearly enough as I went drifting at the height of several hundred yards above a vast, desolated space near the junction of two rivers. Perhaps, however, desolated is not the word I should use. I should say rather shattered, pulverized, obliterated, for a scene of more utter and hopeless ruin I have never seen nor imagined. Over an area of many square miles there was nothing but heaps and mounds of broken stone, charred and crumbling brick, fire-scarred timbers, and huge contorted masses of rusting steel like the decaying bones of superhuman monsters. From the great height and extent of the piles of debris, and from the occasional sight of the splintered cornice of a roof or some battered window frame of door, I knew that this had once been a city, one of the world's greatest, but no other recognizable feature remained amid the grey masses of ruins, and the very streets and avenues had been erased. But here and there a tremendous crater, 300 feet across and 100 to 150 feet deep, indicated the source of the destruction. As if to reinforce the dread idea that had taken possession of my brain, one of the comet-like red prodigies went streaking across the sky even as I gazed down at the dead city, and I knew, as clearly as if I had seen the whole spectacle with my own eyes, that the missile had sprung from a source hundreds or thousands of miles away, possibly across the ocean, and that, laden with scores of tons of explosives, it had been hurled with unerring mechanical accuracy upon its mission of annihilation. Then I seemed to float over vast distances of that sunset-tinted land, and saw great craters in the fields, and villages shot to ribbons, and farms abandoned, and the wild dogs fought for the wild cattle, and thistles grew deep on acres where wheat had been planted, and weeds sprouted thickly in the orchards, and blight and mildew competed for the crops. But though here and there I could see a dugout, with traces of fire and abandoned tools flung about at random, nowhere in all that dismal world did I observe a living man. After a time I returned to a place near the ruined city by the two rivers, and in the rocky palisades above one of the streams I made out some small circular holes barely large enough to admit a man, and borne onward by some impulse of curiosity and despair, I entered one of those holes and went downward, far downward into the dim recesses. And now for the first time, at a depth of hundreds of yards, I did at last encounter living men. My first thought was that I had gone back to the day of the caveman, for a cave-like hollow had been scooped out in the solid rock. It was true that the few hundreds of people huddled together there had the dress and looks of moderns. It was true also that the gloom was lighted for them by electric bulbs, and that electric radiators kept them warm. Yet Dante himself, in painting the 9th circle of his Inferno, could not have imagined a drearier and more despondent group than these that slouched and drooped and muttered in that cavernous recess, seated with their heads fallen low upon their knees, or moodily pacing back and forth like captives who can hope for no escape. "Here at least we will be safe from the sky marauders," I heard one of them muttering. Yet I could not help wondering what the mere safety of the body could mean when all the glories of man's civilization were annihilated. 2. There came a whirring in my head, and another blank interval, and when I regained my senses, I knew that another period of time had passed, possibly months or even years. I stood on the palisade above the river, near the entrance of the caves, and the sun was bright above me, but there was no brightness in the men and women that trailed out of a small circular hole in the ground, drab as dock rats, and pasty pale of countenance as hospital inmates, and with bent backs and dirty tattered clothes, and a mouse-like nosing manner, they emerged with the wariness of hunted refugees, and they flung up their hands with low cries to shield them from the brilliance of the sun, to which they were evidently unaccustomed. From the packs on their backs and the bundles in their hands, I knew that they were emerging from their subterranean refuge to try to begin a new life in the ravaged world above. And my heart went out to them, for I saw that, few as they were, not more than 50 in all, they were the sole survivors of a once populous region, and would have a bitter fight to wage in the man-made wilderness that had been a world metropolis. But as they roamed above, through the waste of ash and rubble, and as they wandered abroad where the fields had been, and saw how every brush and tree had been seared from the earth or poisoned by chemical brews, I knew that their fight was not merely a bitter one, it was hopeless. And I heard them muttering among themselves, "We have not even any tools." And again, "We have no fuel left for the great machines." For they had lived in a highly mechanical world, and the technicians who alone understood the workings of that world had all been destroyed, and the sources of power had all been cut off, and the power was the food without which they could not long survive. Unable to endure their haggard hangdog looks and grim despondent eyes, I went wandering far away, over the length and breadth of many lands, and nowhere did I see a factory that had not been hammered to dust, nor a village that had not been unroofed or burnt, nor a farm where the workers went humming on their merry toilsome way. Yet here and there I did observe little knots of survivors. Sometimes there were half-clad groups, lean and ferocious as famished wolves, who roamed the houseless countryside with stones and clubs, hunting the wild birds and hares, or making meagre meals from bark and roots. Sometimes 3 or 4 men, with the frenzied eyes and hysterical shrieks and shouts of maniacs, would emerge from a brush hut by a river flat. Sometimes little bands of men and women, in a dazed, aimless way, would go wandering about a huge jagged hole in the ground, where their homes and their loved ones lay buried. I came upon solitary refugees high up on the scarred mountain slopes, with nothing but a staff to lean upon, and a deerskin to keep them warm. I saw more than one twisted form lying motionless at the foot of a precipice. I witnessed a battle between 2 half-crazed, ravenous bands, with murder and cannibalism and horrors too grisly to report. I observed brave men resolutely trying to till the soil, whose productive powers had been ruined by a poisoned spray from the sky, and I noted some who, though the fields remained fertile enough, had not the seed to plant, and others who had not the tools with which to plough and reap, and some who, with great labour, managed to produce enough for 3 or 4 mouths, had 20 or 30 to feed, and where the 3 or 4 might have lived, the 20 or 30 perished. Then, with a great sadness, I knew that man, having become civilized, cannot make himself into a savage again. He has come to depend upon science for his sustenance, and when he himself has destroyed the means of employing that science, he is as a babe without milk, and it is not necessary to destroy all men in order to exterminate mankind. One need only take from him the prop of his mechanical inventions. 3. Again there came a blankness, and I passed over a stretch of time, perhaps over years, or even decades, and I had wandered far in space, to an island somewhere on a sunny sea, and there once more I heard the sound of voices, and somehow, through some deeper sense, I knew that these were the voices of the only men left anywhere on the whole wide planet, and I looked down on them, and saw that they were but few, no more than a dozen men and women in all, with 3 or 4 children among them. But their faces, unlike those which I had seen before, were not haggard and seamed, nor avid like those of hunting beasts, nor distorted by fury or famine. Their brows were broad and noble, and their eyes shone with the sweetness of great thoughts, and their smiles were as unuttered music. And when they glanced at me with their clear, level gaze, I knew that they were such beings as poets had pictured as dwellers in a far tomorrow. And I did not feel sad, though I could not forget that they were the only things in human form that one could find on all earth's shores, and though I knew that they were too few to perpetuate their kind for long. Somehow I felt some vast benevolent spirit in control, that these most perfect specimens of our race should endure when all the wreckers had vanished. As I watched, I saw the people all turning their eyes to an eastern mountain, whose summit still trailed the golden of the dawn clouds. And from above the peak, a great illuminated sphere, like a chariot of light, miraculously came floating down, and the blaze was such that I could hardly bear to look at it, and exclamations of wonder and joy came from the people's throats, and I too cried out in joy and wonder as the radiant globe descended, and as it alighted on the plain before us, casting a sun-like aura over everything in sight. Then, through the sides of the enormous ball, I would not say through the door, for nothing of the kind was visible, a glorious being emerged, followed by several of his kind. He was shaped like a man, and was no taller than a man, and yet there was that about him which said that he was greater than a man, for light seemed to pour from every cell of his body, and a golden halo was about his head, and his eyes shot forth golden beams so intense and so magnetic that, once having observed them, I could hardly take my gaze away. With slow steps he advanced, motioning the people to him, and they drew near, and flung themselves before him on the ground, and cried out in adoration, and I too threw myself to earth in worship of this superhuman creature, and I heard the words he spoke, and with some deeper sense I translated them, though they were not uttered in any language I knew. Out of the stars we come, O men, and back to the stars we shall go, that the best of your race may be transplanted there, and survive through means known to us, and again be populous and great. Through the immense evil within the breasts of your kind, you have been purged and all but annihilated, but the good within your race has also been mighty, and can never be expunged, and that good has called through your surviving few to us, your guardians, that we may take you to another planet, and replenish you there, and teach you that lore of love and truth and beauty which the blind members of your species have neglected here while they unfitted the earth for human habitation. So speaking, the Radiant One motioned to the people, who arose and followed him inside the great sphere of light, and when they had all entered, it slowly began to ascend, and slowly dwindled and disappeared against the morning skies. And now I knew there was no longer a man left anywhere on earth. Yet, as I gazed at the deserted shore, the empty beach, and the bare mountainside, a sense of supreme satisfaction came over me, as though I knew that in the end, after fire and agony and degradation, all was eternally well. That sense of supreme satisfaction remained with me when, after still another blank interval, I opened my eyes as from a deep slumber, and stared at the familiar book-rack, the bureau, the mottled paper walls of my own room. The clock on the little table at my side indicated the hour of 10:09. In other words, all that had happened had occurred in the space of 1 minute. Yet I know as surely as I know that I write these words, that the release drug had freed my spirit to range over thousands of miles of space, and that I have looked on people and events which no other eye will view for scores, hundreds, or even thousands of years to come. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. You know, many of these stories were written in a time where 50 years ago was in the future.